Contra Graecum, against the Greek, is a phrase used in the critical apparatus of the so-called Oxford Vulgate, a scholarly edition of the Vulgate text which was published in the first half of the 20th century. Even today, the Oxford Vulgate still offers the most extensive presentation of textual variants of the Latin tradition of many books of the New Testament. In addition to over 50 Vulgate witnesses, the critical apparatus also includes information from Old Latin manuscripts, early Christian authors, and additional references to printed editions. In its editorial text of the Vulgate, however, it has been replaced by that of the so-called Stuttgart Vulgate, and here in its 5th edition of 2007. One special feature of the apparatus is the numerous references to Greek sources, in particular remarks concerning the relation of the Greek and Latin tradition. In this regard, the phrase contra Graecum is used to indicate when certain manuscripts, individual early Christian authors, or the entire Latin attestation reads a text that is not, or only rarely, present in the Greek witnesses. It is this phenomenon of the Greek and Latin witnesses fundamentally differing, which is the focus of this paper. Specifically, and for illustrative purposes, I shall discuss 3 examples from 1 Corinthians, a letter for which both the Editio Critica Major and the Vetus Latina edition are currently being produced at KU Leuven in Belgium. And this is the moment where I would like to thank my funding bodies, the FWO, the Research Foundation Flanders, and the ERC, the European Research Council, for their generous support of my research, also leading to this paper today. My first example for a fundamental difference between the Greek and Latin starts with a difference in editions. There is, of course, no need to point out that our current chapter and verse divisions of the New Testament are not ancient. Modern chapters follow a division from the 30th century, traditionally connected with Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, and the verse divisions largely follow that of the printed edition of Robert Estienne, or Roberto Stephanus, in 1551. That edition presents not only a Greek text, but also 2 versions of the Latin text, Erasmus' Latin translation in the outer column, and the Vulgate version in smaller print in the inner column. With one exception in 1 Corinthians, the Nestle-Aland 28 and the UBS 5 editions follow this verse division, in line with von Soden's edition of 1913. Already in Estienne's edition of 5051, the verse number at 1 Corinthians 7:33 to 34 differs between the Greek and the Latin text. The different verse divisions, and even more so the different punctuations, hint at the editorial interpretation of a textual attestation that is complex and diverse. The main issue affecting the sentence and verse division is the interpretation of the passive perfect form memeristai, which can refer to both the masculine ho gamesas and the feminine he gune. Both interpretations are reflected in the punctuation of modern editions. Nestle-Aland 28 interprets memeristai as a masculine form with the subject ho gamesas. The married man is divided in his interests. Estienne in 1551 reads it together with he gune kai he patenos, divided is the woman and the virgin. To understand this, the Latin attestation can help. As so often the case when it comes to the so-called versions, that is the early translations of the Greek text, they are a useful source not only for understanding the transmission of the New Testament text, but also for its interpretation. This is in particular the case in those instances where the target language cannot fully mirror the source text. In 1 Corinthians 7:33 to 34, the passive perfect form in Latin consists of the perfect passive participle and the auxiliary verb esse, to be. The participle is formed as masculine, feminine, or neuter. In the Latin transmission of our verses, both the masculine divisus and the feminine form divisa are attested, and the latter in several Old Latin witnesses. The reading divisa led to an interpretation of the passage in various Christian authors who discuss the difference between an unmarried woman and a virgin. One of these authors is Jerome, who, however, is aware of different attestations and interpretations of the passage. In Contra Jovinianum, he writes, "Now I briefly remind you of this, that in the Latin manuscripts this passage is read as follows: Divided is the woman and the virgin. Although this has its own meaning and has been interpreted in that way by me too, according to the context of the passage, it does not testify to apostolic truth. For the apostle certainly wrote, as we have translated above, he is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please his wife, and he is divided." Jerome clearly favors the masculine reading here in green as the intended reading of Paul. Yet that did not stop him from also finding sense and meaning in the feminine form divisa, here in red. Now, to be sure, my focus here is neither on the editorial text of the Greek or Latin, nor on the very complex textual attestation of this passage. The 2 points I want to make are these. First, the Greek text with its passive perfect memeristai is ambiguous. Both a masculine and a feminine understanding are attested in Old Latin witnesses. Jerome identifies the masculine as the Pauline one, and also the Vulgate favors the masculine, with Vulgate editions consequently reading it as the end of the sentence in verse 33. In the Greek attestation, however, it is the later majority text that connects memeristai with the following feminine noun, which is where SDN's edition of 1551 also places it. The rendering in Nestle Aland 28, however, is divided in its loyalty. The punctuation identifies memeristai as part of the sentence in verse 33, yet it is placed within verse 34. The second point I want to make has to do with the founding edition of modern verse divisions. From the very beginning in 1551, the Greek and Latin verse traditions go against each other, reflecting different attestations of the text, as just mentioned. When editing a text, editors must make decisions. To some extent, we can say that just like Jerome, SDN was aware of different interpretations of the text. He puts them right next to each other in his edition, but he did not see any need to harmonize them in his edition, let alone in his verse division. My second example for a place where the Latin tradition goes against the Greek is 1 Corinthians 15:5. In the well-known greed of Christ's resurrection and the appearance of Christ to his disciples. In the Greek transmission, Christ appeared to the 12. By contrast, in the Latin transmission, he appeared to 11, a number which the Latin manuscript tradition consistently reads contra Graecum, against the Greek. There are only a few exceptions among the extant Greek manuscripts in which 11 is read instead of 12. The critical apparatus of Nestle Aland 28 lists the first hand of Codex Claromontanus, Codex Augiensis, and Codex Boernerianus. Metzger, in his textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, also mentions minuscules 330 and the first hand of what he still knew as manuscript 464, but which has now been reunited with 252 in the Kurzgefasste Liste der griechischen Handschriften des Neuen Testaments. Based on collations of test passages and ongoing work on the Editio Critica Maya of 1 Corinthians, we can add the majuscule 0150 and 11 minuscules to this list of Greek manuscripts, which also read 11. The earliest among these witnesses are Greek-Latin bilingual manuscripts, which are a fascinating group of texts in their appearance and in their potential mutual influence. In almost all instances, the two languages in such bilingual manuscripts are not a direct translation one of the other. However, they often portray awareness of the other language. This can, for example, be seen when the text in both languages is aligned in so-called sense lines, that is, corresponding units of text of various lengths. Mutual influence between the languages can also be seen when readings are adapted, and when glosses and corrections are added, be it by the first hand or at a later point. Let's have a look at the main bilingual witnesses for 1 Corinthians 15:5, which are listed in Nestle Aland 28 as witnesses for the Greek text reading 11. The oldest among them is Codex Claromontanus, which was copied probably in southern Italy around the middle of the 5th century CE. The text is presented in sans lines on facing pages, with the Greek text written in majuscule script on the left and the Latin written on the right page in uncial script. Codex Boanerianus was copied in St. Gall in 860-870 CE. It is an interlinear manuscript, meaning that the Latin text in insular minuscule script is written above the Greek text. The Latin is mainly based on that Greek text and follows the Greek grammar and word order. Thus, there are unique readings in the Latin not otherwise attested in extant manuscripts, as we will see in my third example today. The manuscript is also known for its many pairs of alternative readings in the Latin part, usually separated by the Latin word well, meaning or. And the third bilingual manuscript is Codex Augiensis, copied in Reichenau in the last third of the 9th century CE. It presents the text in 2 columns, with Greek always being in the inner and broader column, and Latin always being in the outer and narrower column of each page. As such, this arrangement is different to the more common presentation in 2 columns in other bilingual manuscripts, where one language is usually always on the left and the other always on the right. The Greek part of Codex Augiensis is either a direct copy of Codex Boanerianus, as suggested recently by Alec Fisher in New Testament Studies, or comes from the same source. The Old Latin text is close to Vulgate readings, and these are the readings here at 1 Corinthians 15:5. The readings show that there is cross-influence between the languages, because not only do all of them read the number 11 in Greek and Latin, they also share the same prepositional phrase beforehand. The Latin side reads either et post haec or the alternative et post ea, with Codex Boanerianus reading both and introducing the alternative reading with well, the Latin word for or. Both the at and the following phrase go against the Greek attestation, except for these 3 bilinguals, where the Greek side, kai meta tauta, corresponds with the Latin. The rest of the Greek transmission reads either eta, like in Papyrus 46, or ep eta, like in Codex Sinaiticus, which usually is translated as de inde in Latin. Yet as the apparatus of the Oxford Vulgate says, apud Latinus non reditur, eta is not rendered in Latin. As previously stated, the Greek attestation for Kreinecker is infrequent, and the oldest extant witnesses are Greek-Latin bilingual manuscripts. While accommodation towards one language has been detected in these bilinguals, Fröhlich and others observe that this usually happens at the expense of the Latin text. In 1 Corinthians 15:5, however, such an accommodation seems unlikely, given that the overall Latin attestation for 11 is predominant and the overall Greek attestation for the number 11 is weak. The accommodation, thus, goes the other direction. The known non-bilingual manuscripts, which read Kreinecker, are 14 in number, and several of them are suspected or known to be closely related, including the commentary manuscript 0150 and 2110. Also, the Greek rendering, kai meta tauta, does not seem attested outside the bilinguals and may indeed have been influenced by the Latin tradition in which this reading is strongly attested. With evidence for the number 12 in the Latin biblical manuscripts almost inexistent, there is, however, some awareness of the number 12 in Latin early Christian authors. For example, Augustine discusses the passage in De Consenso Evangelistarum when he compares the different stories of appearances of Jesus Christ after his resurrection in the Gospels and in Paul. The purpose for Augustine is to show not only that the congruence of the 4 evangelists shines forth from this matter, but also that they agree with Paul the Apostle, who speaks about this matter in the first epistle to the Corinthians. What follows is a harmonizing discussion of the account of the four Gospels and Paul, which Augustine concludes by stating that there are no discrepancies in the accounts. After this, he cites 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, and his commentary on the passage shows that he was aware of both readings, 11 and 12. But thus, it is not clear to which 12 Christ appeared, just as it is not clear to which 500. For it could be that these 12 were some from the crowd of the disciples, I do not know which. For he could no longer refer to those whom he called apostles as 12, but as 11, as some codices have it, and which I believe some confused people amended, thinking that it was said about the 12 apostles, who were now 11 after Judas had died. But whether those codices have a more accurate reading, which have 11, or whether Paul wanted some other 12 disciples to be meant, or whether he would have wanted the sacred number also to remain in the 11, because among them the number 12 was so mystical that in order to preserve the mystery of that number, no one else could be elected in Judas' place except Matthias. Now, whichever of these may be the case, nothing results from it that could seem to contradict the truth or any most truthful narrator among them. The question how the number 12 can refer to a group of 11 people is also discussed elsewhere by Augustine. In his Questiones Ingenesim, Augustine explains the use of the number 12 as a synecdoche. And a synecdoche is a figure of speech which refers either to a part of something in place of the whole, known as pars pro toto, or to the whole in place of a part, totum pro parte. These examples from Augustine show that absence in extant biblical manuscripts does not imply absence of awareness of different readings. It is noteworthy that despite of the discrepancy, Augustine did not see the need to disregard one of them. On the contrary, he found meaning in both 11 and 12. So just like Jerome found meaning in both divisa and divisus, feminine and masculine reading. Some concluding thoughts on my second example. In his textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, Metzger said about this passage, instead of recognizing that Dodeca is used here as an official designation, several witnesses, chiefly Western, have introduced the pedantic correction hendeca. Given that the entire Latin tradition reads this pedantic rendering as well, some more observations can be made to conclude my second point. First, the different attestations in each language tradition are strong. Secondly, Latin patristic literature attests an awareness of the variant readings in the manuscript tradition and the difference between Greek and Latin. And thirdly, the discrepancy in the textual attestation is not seen as a problem or as something that needs to be corrected. On the contrary, a harmonizing treatment of textual discrepancies is well known from early Christian authors. This reflects a theological understanding that textual variants would not compromise the truth of Scripture. My third example for a Latin reading contra Graecum is 1 Corinthians 14:11, which stands in a passage on speaking in tongues and different languages and their intelligibility. For context, I read the New Revised Standard Version in the updated edition, starting in 1 Corinthians 14:6. Now, brothers and sisters, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will I benefit you unless I speak to you in some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching? It is the same way with lifeless instruments that produce sounds such as the flute or the harp. If they do not give distinct notes, how will what is being played on the flute or harp be recognized? And if the bugle gives an indistinct sound, who will get ready for battle? So with yourselves. If in a tongue you utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anyone know what is being said? For you will be speaking into the air. There are doubtless many different kinds of sounds in the world, and nothing is without sound. If then I do not know the meaning of a sound, I will be a foreigner, a barbaros to the speaker, and the speaker a foreigner, a barbaros to me. So with yourselves, since you are striving after spiritual gifts, seek to excel in them for building up the church. Therefore, one who speaks in a tongue should pray for the power to interpret. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unproductive. Leaving aside discussions about the English translation of the New Revised Standard Version and also discussions of speaking in tongues, my question is, who is the barbarian in 1 Corinthians 14:11? The answer differs depending on the language. The Greek text identifies basically two different kinds of barbarians. The first barbarian in apodosis A is the listener, who does not understand the speaker's words, as the protasis implies. If then I do not know the meaning of the sound, I will be a barbarian to the one speaking. The second barbarian in apodosis B is the speaker who is incomprehensible to the listener, and the one speaking will be a barbarian to me. In both instances, the listener is the first-person narrator of the protasis, who does not understand the meaning. In the Greek rendering, there's one scene, one act of communication, one speaker, one listener. Both the listener and the speaker are described respectively as barbarians in the eyes of the other. In the Latin tradition, however, the case is different. To start with the Vulgate, the text says in translation, "If then I do not know the meaning of the sound, I will be a barbarian to the one to whom I speak, and he who speaks will be a barbarian to me." In Latin, there are also two barbarians, but both are the speakers. Once it is the first-person narrator in apodosis A, once it is another person in apodosis B. Instead of one act of communication, there are now two acts, two speakers. The main difference between the Greek and Latin here is in the first part of the apodosis. In the Greek, the speaker is the other person who is speaking. In the Latin, and Contra Graecum, the speaker is the first-person narrator of the protasis. The scenario of the first apodosis is thus that the speaker himself does not understand what he is saying. And it is this which makes him a barbarian to the listener. But when does a speaker not understand his or her own words? When speaking in tongues? Before coming back to that question, let's first have a closer look at the textual transmission. And we start with the manuscript attestation Contra Graecum. The Latin attestation is consistent in identifying two speakers as the barbarians. The two Greek participles are rendered as relative clauses. This is not unusual as such. On the contrary, there is a tendency in Latin to replace participles by relative clauses with a finite verb. This occurs regularly also when the Latin could have replicated the Greek participle, as is the case here. Lalunti could be loquenti, and lalon could be loquens in Latin. The predominant Latin rendering of 1 Corinthians 14:11 is attested already prior to the Vulgate in various Old Latin manuscripts, and here are some examples. Without a change in meaning, Codex Gigas, Vetus Latina 51, reads the first relative clause without an antecedent, and the so-called phrasing fragments, Vetus Latina 64, which are lacunose in the first part, read the pronoun ille as an antecedent in the second part. Unlike in my previous example from 1 Corinthians 15:5, where the early bilinguals read the same text in the Greek and Latin, here in 1 Corinthians 14:11, all bilinguals which preserve text in both languages do not correspond to each other, with the exception of Codex Borroneanus, which we will see in a moment. Now, for the manuscript attestation that reads cum Graeco, with the Greek. The Latin reading in 1 Corinthians 14:11 Contra Graecum is remarkably strong. As far as I'm aware, none of the Greek extant witnesses reads a text similar to the Latin, whereas on the Latin side, only two manuscripts read a text that represents the Greek tradition. The first is a bilingual witness, the interlinear Greek-Latin Codex Boernerianus. As mentioned already earlier, this codex offers a direct translation of the Greek text present in the same manuscript, so that the Latin regularly follows the Greek grammar and word order. It is therefore not surprising, but rather to be expected, that this one manuscript has a literal rendering matching the Greek tradition, not the attestation of other Latin manuscripts. In the first apodosis, the participle in Greek is replicated in Latin, loquenti, as you can see here in red. And in the second apodosis, as you can see here in blue, the Greek participle is rendered as a relative clause and has an alternative reading introduced with well or loquens. The so-called anonymous Budapest commentary, Vetus Latina 89, is the second Latin witness which reads a text reflecting the Greek meaning, both in its lemma text and in its commentary. There, the first participle in the Greek, to lalunti, is rendered as e qui loquitur, to him who speaks, and the second, is qui loquitur, is in line with Codex Boernerianus. From the perspective of textual history, Vetus Latina 89 is an interesting witness. It transmits the biblical text as lemmata within a commentary, which was probably originally composed in Rome around the year 400 CE. It mainly preserves Old Latin readings without those adaptations towards the Greek, which can be seen in bilinguals, and largely without corrections towards typical Vulgate readings. In the case of 1 Corinthians 14:11, however, Vetus Latina 89 is the most Greek witness of all the extant manuscripts. Without an accompanying Greek text of a bilingual to account for the Greek rendering in Latin, as is the case in Codex Boernerianus, there is not much further explanation as to why this one witness reads a text cum Graeco and contra Latinum, although affiliation to the bilingual tradition of Vetus Latina 89 has been suggested at other instances. Let's now return to the Latin rendering that a speaker appears as a barbarian to the listener when the speaker does not understand his or her own words. Could it be that the Latin tradition is thinking primarily of speaking in tongues when reading 1 Corinthians 14:11, and not of a human language in general, or of the sound and meaning of signals, as in 1 Corinthians 14:7, 8, and 10. At this point, it would be helpful to consider some non-Christian sources and their use of the word barbarian and intelligibility of languages, both in documentary and literary sources. However, that would be a paper in its own right, and I shall focus on early Christian interpretations of the biblical passage. Unlike in my previous case regarding the question of 11 or 12 in 1 Corinthians 15:5, I have not been able to find any passage where variant readings are discussed by early Christian authors in relation to 1 Corinthians 14:11. However, in Ambrose, there seems to be at least awareness of the Greek biblical rendering, according to which both speaker and listener are barbarians. In the Excessro Fratris Satyri, he emphasizes that in order not to appear as a barbarian, the understanding of a sound is crucial for both the listener and the speaker. And with a reference to 1 Corinthians 14:13, he also expresses the necessity for prayer to be able to understand one's own words, like in the Latin general tradition. Vice versa, the idea that the speaker needs to understand himself is also expressed in the Greek tradition by John Chrysostom in his homily 35 on 1 Corinthians. There he also comments on 1 Corinthians 14:11 and refers to it once more after having cited 1 Corinthians 13:13 to 15. And he writes, have you seen how he, Paul, gradually bringing forward the argument, shows that such a person is not only useless to others, but also to himself, if indeed his mind is unproductive to him. For if somebody speaks only in the Persian tongue or in any other foreign tongue, and now the part in red, but does not understand what he is saying, then he will be a barbarian to himself too, not only to the other, because he does not know the meaning of the sound. For indeed, there were many in the past who also had the gift of prayer with a tongue, and they prayed, and the tongue uttered a sound while praying, either in the Persian or the Roman language. But the mind did not understand what was being said. Therefore, he also said, if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, that is the gift given to me and moving the tongue, but my mind is unproductive. So far, John Chrysostom. This may not necessarily mean that an equivalent to the Latin reading of 1 Corinthians 14:11 was also present in the Greek. That's not my point here. But it may show that when reading the entire passage in context, the expectation that the speaker too would need to understand his own words was present in Greek interpretations. It may be that such an understanding may have become predominant and caused the Latin attestation. As pointed out earlier, versions are often a useful source for analyzing how a New Testament passage was read and interpreted in a certain context. And it seems to me that the Latin tradition here predominantly interpreted 1 Corinthians 14:11 in relation to speaking in tongues, like in 1 Corinthians 14:9 and 13. And the Greek, however, in its rendering, still includes other languages and sounds, like in 1 Corinthians 14:7, 8, and 10. Some concluding thoughts on my final example. Metzger does not comment on 1 Corinthians 14:11 in his textual commentary on the Greek New Testament. Perhaps this is inherent in the nature of the example. Why would a consistent transmission in Greek look at potential other versional readings? Moreover, it is even standard practice in creating critical editions, including the Editio Critica Major, to look only at those instances in the versions which support an extant Greek variant reading. From such a perspective, the Latin rendering of 1 Corinthians 14:11 is useless to a Greek critical edition. And vice versa, why should a Latin critical edition, with such a strong attestation contra Graecum, bother too much about a Greek transmission that does not provide in its extant witnesses a Vorlage, an exemplar for the Latin reading? Yet once more, it is the bilingual evidence that makes one pause and look deeper. For the Latin wording may be against the Greek textual evidence, but it is not necessarily against the Greek interpretation of the entire passage. This is particularly noticeable when reading 1 Corinthians 14:11 through the lenses of speaking in tongues in 1 Corinthians 14:9 and 13, as executed both in Latin by Ambrose and in Greek by John Chrysostom. Let's come to general conclusions. Today I have discussed 3 examples of differences between the Greek and the Latin transmission of the New Testament. I have done so from the perspective of the Latin, which reads a text contra Graecum, potentially with interpretative consequences. My first example was from modern printed editions and the challenges that come with punctuation and a verse division at a place where the manuscript transmission is complex. Unlike scholars who talk about variant readings in their presentations or in articles, editors have to make decisions and have to select 1 or perhaps 2 variants in their editorial text. While they can still tell the more complex story in their critical apparatus and commentary, they have to trust that scholars using their editorial text will understand that it is a text of the New Testament, not the text. My second example was about the different number of people to whom Christ appeared in 1 Corinthians 15:5. It was an example where the overall Latin transmission is consistent with only very little support in the Greek tradition, which may have been influenced from the Latin altogether. Perhaps Metzger is right, and the Latin tradition here is simply pedantic. However, it is often in exactly those small details that the big questions can be asked. Where do these differences come from? Why have they never been adapted to each other? The answer to the latter is not that people were not aware of the differences. but rather that people did not understand them as a threat or as diminishing the meaning of the biblical text, as we could see explicitly in some of the early Christian authors. And my third example from 1 Corinthians 14:11 and the case of the barbarian speaker was one where there is no support in Greek for the Latin reading, and moreover, where discussion in the early Christian authors does not provide too much additional insight. One could argue that it is usually the case that the speaker also understands his or her own words, or at least has an idea what he or she wants to say when speaking in another language. Therefore, a point can be made that the Latin rendering, which implies that the speaker does not understand his own words, has frozen or narrowed the passage to refer to speaking in tongues only, like in 1 Corinthians 14:9 and 13. Having discussed 3 examples from ongoing research on bilinguals and 1 Corinthians, one may think that these are rather random and may not provide a conclusive picture. Perhaps that is true, especially for the overly pessimistic. While each example may be unique, it ultimately reflects the main challenges that make the textual history of the New Testament so complex and so fascinating. Contamination, coincidence of readings, incompleteness of the textual attestation, and in the case of bilingual manuscripts, the proof of cross-influence with and without further impact on the overall transmission of the New Testament. Now, what is the moral of the story? Clearly, I hope that I have not been a barbarian to you as the listener, neither in my choice of language nor in my choice of content, but overall, I would say the moral of the story is don't be a barbarian, become a text critic instead. Thank you very much for your attention.